Right now, as you sit there, someone in your life is quietly mapping out your boundaries. They are testing the waters. They say something slightly off, a subtle dig masked as a passing joke, and they watch your eyes. You smile. You let it slide. You tell yourself it isn't worth the conflict, or that it is better to take the high road. But they did not see a peacemaker. They saw a door left wide open. Power never announces its arrival. It simply rearranges the room. Let us examine a scene you know intimately well. You are sitting in a room, perhaps a high-stakes meeting, or perhaps just a crowded table with people you consider peers. An issue hangs in the air, a problem that needs solving, or a moment where someone needs to step up and claim authority. You have the answer. You have the exact right thing to say, calculated and precise. But you pause. You run the words through the heavy filter of your mind. You check them for flaws. You ensure they sound polite. You make sure you will not accidentally bruise the ego of the person sitting across from you. You are waiting for the perfect opening in the conversation. You are waiting for permission to be brilliant, and in that agonizing 3-second gap, someone else speaks. They do not have a better idea than you. In fact, their idea is likely half-formed, a crude and messy sketch of what you were about to deliver flawlessly. But they did not ask for permission. They simply reached out and took the oxygen in the room. You watch as heads nod in agreement. You watch as the credit is effortlessly assigned to them. You sit there in silence, comforting yourself with the desperate lie that you are just a deep thinker, that you are a strategist playing the long game. You are not playing the long game. You are losing the only game that is actually being played. We are conditioned from childhood to believe that patience is a virtue, that good things come to those who wait in line, raise their hands, and faithfully follow the invisible rules of polite society. This is a highly convenient narrative for those who are already in power. It keeps the masses docile. It keeps you waiting for a turn that is never going to arrive. Hesitation is not patience. Hesitation is fear wearing a respectable suit. It is the terrified animal inside you, freezing in the harsh headlights of potential judgment. Every single time you delay an action because you are overthinking the optics, you broadcast a glaring signal to the predators in the room. You tell them, without speaking a word, that you do not trust your own footing. When Niccolo Machiavelli observed the brutal survival of leaders and strategists, he did not find that the most intelligent individuals always secured the victory. Intelligence is surprisingly common. What he found was that the ones who survived, the ones who dictated the terms of reality, were those who understood the ruthless geometry of timing. They understood that the space between a decision and an action is a dead zone where leverage goes to die. When you hesitate, you are effectively bleeding in the water. You become what strategists call a mark. A mark is not necessarily weak, and they are certainly not stupid. A mark is simply someone who telegraphs their reluctance to defend their own interests. Think about the co-worker who always asks if it is a good time before presenting a necessary demand. Think about the individual who over-explains their reasons for setting a basic personal boundary. When you over-explain, you are subtly begging the other person to validate your right to exist. You are handing them the judge's gavel and desperately hoping they rule in your favor. The sharpest minds in any room never ask for the gavel. They do not enter a negotiation offering a defensive thesis on why they deserve a seat at the table. They simply occupy the space. They let their presence be an established fact rather than a question waiting to be answered. Consider the sheer amount of energy you have wasted in your life rehearsing conversations that never actually took place. You construct entire courtrooms in your head. You argue with ghosts. You try to mathematically formulate the perfect sequence of words that will force someone to respect you without triggering their anger. It is a comforting illusion, this idea that if you are just reasonable enough, cautious enough, and invisible enough, you will eventually be rewarded for your good behavior. But the world does not reward the invisible. The world simply ignores them, or worse, assigns them the heavy lifting, while someone faster, someone more decisive, collects the prize. To break this relentless pattern, you must begin to view your own politeness with extreme suspicion. The next time you feel the instinct to wait for the perfect moment, recognize that the perfect moment is a myth designed to keep you paralyzed in place. There is only the present moment, and there is the action you either take or surrender. When you feel that familiar tightening in your chest, the urge to swallow your words, to soften your posture, to let someone else speak first, you must interpret that not as a signal to retreat, but as a biological trigger to move. You must train yourself to step into the gap before it closes. You must act before your own mind has the chance to talk you out of your rightful authority. This principle extends far beyond simply speaking up in a crowded room. It applies to every single power dynamic in your life. It applies to the relationship where you are quietly waiting for the other person to finally realize your worth. It applies to the social circle where you endure subtle, mocking disrespect because addressing it directly feels too chaotic. You tell yourself you are simply keeping the peace. You are not keeping the peace. You are stockpiling resentment, and the people stepping on you know it. They rely on your hesitation. They depend heavily on your fear of conflict to maintain their own comfort at your expense. Power never announces its arrival. It simply rearranges the room. You must become the one doing the rearranging. You must stop waiting for the formal invitation to take what is already yours. Stop preparing for every possible outcome. Stop rehearsing your defense. Action creates its own clarity. When you move before you feel entirely ready, you force the rest of the room to adapt to your sudden momentum, rather than spending your entire life adapting to theirs. You flip the dynamic from a panicked defense to a cold, calculated offense, and you do it without ever raising your voice. This raw speed, this absolute refusal to hesitate, is the necessary foundation of taking back control. It stops the bleeding. It removes the target from your back. But being fast is only half the equation. The real advantage comes from what you allow them to believe about you. While raw speed stops you from becoming a target, the true strategist knows that speed without disguise is just recklessness. The greatest advantage lies in what you allow the room to believe about you. Moving fast is how you claim the ground, but cultivating underestimation is how you hold it. Think of the classic mistake made by almost every eager newcomer, whether they are stepping into a corporate hierarchy, a new social circle, or a complex interpersonal dynamic. They arrive carrying the heavy, desperate baggage of their own ambition. They want to be seen as competent, sharp, and indispensable. So, they talk. They list their credentials. They offer unsolicited solutions to problems that were not assigned to them. They try to forcefully insert themselves into the established pecking order by proving they are the smartest person in the room. This is a fatal miscalculation. When you aggressively announce your brilliance, you do not inspire respect. You trigger the most silent, venomous emotion in human nature, envy. By desperately demonstrating your competence, you force everyone else in the room to measure themselves against you. You awaken their hidden insecurities. You activate their psychological defenses. The very people you were hoping to impress are now quietly calibrating how much of a threat you are to their own standing and status. They will begin to scrutinize your every move, looking for flaws, waiting for the inevitable moment you stumble so they can eagerly remind you of your proper place. By demanding to be seen as a heavyweight, you instantly paint a massive target on your own back. Now, look at the opposite approach. Look at the individual who enters that exact same environment and actively chooses the shadows. They speak far less than necessary. When someone patronizes them or confidently explains something they already know perfectly well, they do not interrupt with a defensive correction. They nod. They ask simple, unassuming questions. They allow the fragile egos around them to inflate, to take the space, to feel dominant and secure. The room quickly reaches a silent, comfortable consensus. This person is harmless. They are average. They are not a threat to anyone's territory. And in that exact moment, the invisible shield is raised. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It is a tactical cloak. When people genuinely believe you are simple, their guard plummets. They stop filtering their words around you. They complain about their superiors. They reveal their hidden alliances. They openly broadcast their vulnerabilities and blind spots because they do not believe you are capable of using that information against them. They hand you the keys to the kingdom simply because they forgot you were standing in the hallway. You become a fly on the wall in rooms you technically have no business being in. Operating this way requires a level of psychological control that most people will never possess. It requires the absolute suppression of the ego. The ego screams for validation. It begs you to correct the arrogant fool who is lecturing you about a topic you mastered years ago. It burns with the desperate desire to prove that you belong, that you are special, that you are better than them. You must strangle that desire. You must learn to find a cold, private pleasure in being entirely misread. When someone talks down to you, you should not feel insulted. You should feel a deep, quiet satisfaction, knowing they have just handed you a massive strategic advantage. You are watching them play checkers while you map out the entire chessboard. Because you are operating under this cloak of harmlessness, you cannot force your agenda through brute authority. If you suddenly start barking orders, the illusion breaks. Instead, you must use a sharper, quieter tool. You must master the Machiavellian art of planting ideas. When a direct command would meet immediate resistance, a planted seed bypasses the ego's immune system entirely. Suppose you need a specific outcome in a project, or you want to steer a social dynamic away from a disastrous decision, but pushing for it directly would arouse suspicion from the established leaders. You do not argue for your plan. You do not present a meticulously researched proposal that demands their submission. Instead, you casually drop an observation. You ask a carefully engineered question that highlights a fatal gap in their current strategy. You say something like, "I was just wondering, what happens if they push back on the timeline?" And then you let your voice trail off. You shrug. You step back into your unassuming persona, and you let the heavy silence do the work. You hand them the missing piece of the puzzle, but you force them to put it together themselves. Given a few hours, or a few days, the human ego will invariably perform a predictable magic trick. The person who heard your subtle question will begin to turn it over in their mind. They will arrive at the exact logical conclusion you pre-designed for them. And because they connected the final dots in their own head, they will genuinely believe the idea was entirely theirs. They will present your exact strategy to the group with absolute conviction. They will fight for it. They will execute it with a level of aggressive passion you could never have forced out of them by simply demanding obedience. Power never announces its arrival. It simply rearranges the room. You just rearrange the architecture of their mind, and they are silently thanking themselves for it. When they inevitably take the credit in front of everyone else, you must not flinch, you must applaud them. The desperate, frantic need for credit is the mark of an amateur playing a short game. The true strategist does not care whose name is engraved on the victory, so long as the victory secures their intended outcome. Let them have the cheap applause. Let them stand in the glaring light of the stage, absorbing all the attention, all the pressure, and all the inevitable criticism when things get difficult. You remain safely in the audience, pulling the invisible strings, completely untouched by the chaos and the crossfire. This is the ultimate freedom. When you are severely underestimated, you move through the world without friction. You observe without being observed. You experiment without judgment. You quietly acquire lethal leverage, while the rest of the room is hopelessly distracted by their own vanity. You become a ghost in the machine, shaping reality without ever leaving a fingerprint. Yet, Remaining in the shadows is useless if you do not know how to survive the inevitable moments when the light hits you. When a direct confrontation is abruptly forced upon you, eventually you will be challenged. Someone will step into your territory, contradict your data, or attempt to undermine your position in front of an audience. It is in this exact moment that most intelligent people destroy their own long-term leverage. Visualize a specific memory. You are in a meeting, a crowded dinner, or a tense family gathering. A disagreement sparks. The other person makes a claim that is demonstrably false, or they present a strategy that is glaringly flawed. You feel the familiar, intoxicating rush of adrenaline. You have the facts on your side. You organize your thoughts, you sharpen your tone, and you dismantle their argument piece by piece. You expose the holes in their logic with surgical precision. The room goes quiet. The other person stammers, unable to formulate a coherent defense, and ultimately retreats into a sullen silence. You walk away feeling untouchable. You believe you have established your dominance. You believe you have won. Then, the timeline extends. 6 months later, a promotion you were in line for quietly evaporates. A crucial email goes unanswered. A collaborative project is inexplicably stalled by a sudden influx of bureaucratic red tape. You find yourself isolated, facing invisible walls that you cannot quite identify. You complain to your friends about office politics. You tell yourself that you are just surrounded by toxic, incompetent people who are intimidated by your brilliance. This is the lie you tell yourself to protect your pride. Here is the cold, unforgiving truth. You are not losing because the world is unfair. You are not losing because people are toxic. You are losing because your ego is desperately addicted to the cheapest, most destructive drug available: public validation. You sacrificed a vital, long-term alliance for the fleeting, momentary high of being right in front of an audience. When you win a public argument so decisively, you do not change the other person's mind. You simply humiliate them. And human beings will forgive almost any transgression, any insult, and any oversight, long before they will ever forgive being made to look foolish in front of their peers. Public humiliation is a psychological debt that is always repaid with interest. By forcefully proving your superiority, you did not neutralize a threat. You created a lifelong, silent enemy who will now dedicate a quiet fraction of their existence to ensuring you do not succeed. They will wait in the weeds for years if they have to, simply to block your path when you least expect it. All of this just because you could not resist the urge to deliver the final word. The true Machiavellian player understands a concept that the average person finds entirely repulsive. It is the art of the small surrender. When you are engaged in a conflict, your first objective is not to protect your pride. It is to identify the actual, tangible outcome you need from the situation. Everything else, the tone of the debate, the minor factual errors, the posturing, is completely irrelevant. It is purely static. If someone challenges you on a minor point, and conceding that point does not materially damage your ultimate objective, you must hand them the victory. You look them in the eye, you soften your posture, and you say, "You make a fair point. I had not considered that." Watch what happens next. The physical tension will immediately drain from their body. Their defensive walls will collapse. Their ego, having been fed the validation it was desperately starving for, will become entirely sedated. They will feel dominant, secure, and respected. Because they now believe they have the upper hand, they will drop their guard. They will become vastly more agreeable to your subsequent suggestions. You have essentially paid a tiny, meaningless toll to access the fast lane. You sacrificed a cheap pawn to maneuver your pieces into position for checkmate. The amateur fights to win every single exchange, exhausting themselves and alienating everyone around them. The strategist loses the battles they do not care about in order to quietly win the war. This requires a brutal severing of your intellect from your identity. Most people fuse the two. They believe that if their idea is rejected, they are personally rejected. They believe that being factually right is the highest possible virtue. It is not. Being right is the consolation prize of the powerless. Academics care about being right. Strategists care about being effective. If allowing someone else to feel like the smartest person in the room accelerates your agenda, then you must eagerly play the role of the willing student. Think about the dynamics in your personal relationships. How many days of cold silence, how many exhausting, circular arguments have you endured simply because neither of you was willing to concede a microscopic, irrelevant detail? You fight over who misremembered a date or who left a cabinet door open, turning a passing moment into a grim trial of character. You burn down your own sanctuary just to prove a point. The cost of these petty victories is astronomical. You trade intimacy, trust, and peace for the hollow satisfaction of hearing someone admit defeat. When you strip away the romanticized illusions of human interaction, you realize that almost every conflict is simply a negotiation of egos. The person who needs their ego fed the least is the person who wields all the actual control. When you no longer crave the applause of the crowd, when you no longer need the immediate gratification of proving someone wrong, you become incredibly dangerous. You become impossible to provoke. Your enemies will try to bait you into a reaction, and they will find nothing but empty space. You will simply absorb their attacks, concede their meaningless points, and continue moving your pieces forward while they are still busy celebrating a hollow victory. The next time you feel the heat rising in your chest during a disagreement, you must manually override your instinct to attack. Stop trying to educate the room. Stop trying to prove your own value. Identify the exact outcome you want and ask yourself what meaningless scrap of pride you can toss to the other person to make them clear the path for you. Once you stop fighting for scraps, you can finally see the entire board clearly, but only if you know how to interrogate the silence. You have likely experienced the crushing weight of a quiet room. You are sitting across a table in a salary negotiation, or perhaps sitting across from a partner during a tense, undefined conversation. You state your terms, or you ask a direct question, and the other person gives a short, guarded, non-committal answer. Then, the conversation simply stops, the rhythm breaks, and the heavy air sets in. The silence stretches for 1 second, then 2. By the 3rd second, the tension in your chest becomes nearly unbearable. Your biological programming kicks in, screaming at you that this pause is a primal signal of rejection. Your mind insists that they are judging you, that you asked for too much, that you have offended them, and that you must immediately repair the connection. So, you break. You open your mouth to alleviate the crushing pressure. You clarify your statement. You soften your demand. You offer a massive compromise before they have even formulated a counteroffer. You let out a nervous laugh, diluting your own power just to make the air feel breathable again. You just negotiated entirely against yourself. Silence is not an absence of communication. It is a physical force. It is an emotional vacuum that demands to be filled. Human beings are deeply social, profoundly insecure creatures who rely on continuous verbal feedback to confirm that they are safe, respected, and accepted in the hierarchy of a room. When you intentionally withdraw that feedback, when you simply look at them without responding, you plunge them into a state of psychological freefall. They do not know what you are thinking. They cannot measure your reaction. They do not know if you are angry, amused, calculating, or utterly indifferent. And because they cannot read your baseline, they will instinctively start talking in a desperate attempt to find it. This is the hidden architecture of weaponized silence. When you ask a question and receive a half-truth or a defensive answer, the absolute worst thing you can do is ask a follow-up question. A follow-up question is a lifeline. It gives them a new topic to focus on, a new angle to defend, and a way out of the trap. Instead, you must simply hold their gaze. You let the quiet stretch into the red zone of human discomfort. You let it become painfully, agonizingly awkward. In almost every single instance, the other person will buckle under the sheer weight of that silence. They will start filling the empty space with words, stumbling over their own sentences to break the tension. They will elaborate on their incredibly short answer. They will furiously justify their position. They will volunteer critical information they had fully intended to keep hidden. They will expose their actual timeline, their underlying fears, and the exact limits of their leverage, all because they were terrified of a quiet room. You did not have to pry the truth out of them. You simply provided the void, and they enthusiastically jumped into it, handing you every piece of leverage they possessed. Consider exactly how this operates in a ruthless professional environment. A superior or a competitor gives you a vague, slightly condescending critique of your work, clearly expecting you to become flustered, defensive, and scramble for an excuse. They are waiting for you to hand them the power by begging for their approval and explaining your actions. Imagine the violent shift in the dynamic if, instead of apologizing, you simply nod slowly and say absolutely nothing. You maintain a cold, flat expression. You do not break eye contact. You just watch them. The power in the room immediately inverts. The superior is now the one trapped in the void. Without your defensive energy to push against, their critique hangs in the air, sounding weak and unprovoked. They will almost always start backpedaling. They will soften their tone, or begin explaining their own stress to fill the suffocating gap you created. By entirely refusing to play the role of the panicked subordinate, you elevate your status in a way that words never could. You establish a boundary made of thin air, and they will suddenly find themselves terrified to cross it. The exact same law applies to dating, friendships, and complex personal dynamics. When someone throws out a subtle test, a passive-aggressive comment designed to see how easily you can be rattled, or a manipulative statement meant to make you seek their validation, your silence is the most devastating counterattack available. When you do not react, you starve their ego of the oxygen it was desperately seeking. You demonstrate, without a single syllable, that their words completely lack the mass to move you. They are forced to sit alone with the embarrassing immaturity of their own statement. You do not need to scold them, you simply let the dead air discipline them. To master this technique, you must first master the panic inside your own nervous system. You must relentlessly retrain yourself to view awkward silence not as a social threat, but as a theater where the other person's true nature is about to be revealed on stage. When the pause begins, you must mentally anchor yourself to the floor. Breathe slowly. Let your face go entirely blank. Learn to genuinely enjoy the discomfort of others. Observe their shifting eyes and their nervous fidgeting with the cold detachment of a scientist watching a predictable chemical reaction. The longer you can hold your nerve, the more power you siphon directly from the other side of the table. People are inherently terrified of those who are comfortable in the quiet. It signals a complete and utter lack of neediness. It tells the world that you are not desperate for their validation, their ongoing conversation, or their immediate agreement. You become an enigma in a world of open books. While everyone else is frantically tap dancing for attention, broadcasting their deepest insecurities with every rushed, frantic sentence, you sit in absolute stillness. You allow them to project their fears onto your blank canvas. This level of hyper-awareness changes everything about how you navigate human nature. You stop hearing what people are saying, and you start hearing what they are desperately trying to hide beneath their carefully chosen words. You realize that the entire social game is built on a fragile foundation of manic, nervous energy, and that simply withdrawing your own energy is enough to completely paralyze the board. You transform your internal anxiety into a cold, calculated patience. You become the immovable object that the room is forced to orbit. Knowing how to hold the weight of a room is a rare skill, but knowing exactly when to leave it is what makes you a ghost they can never forget. The most common and arguably the most tragic mistake in human dynamics is the fundamental inability to recognize the end of a cycle. People are inherently greedy for connection, for relevance, and for the comfortable illusion of safety. Because of this primal greed, they hold on. They linger in spaces where their presence has already expired. They overstay their welcome, completely unaware that by doing so, they are actively destroying the very respect they worked so hard to build. Overstaying is the silent assassin of your reputation. Consider the archetype of the loyal employee who stays at a company for years past their prime. In the beginning, they were a revelation. They solved massive problems, they brought vital energy, and they were celebrated. But they stayed. They stayed because the routine felt safe, and because they naively believed that their past loyalty would serve as a permanent shield against future irrelevance. This is a dangerous fantasy. Loyalty in a transactional world is a highly depreciating asset. 5 years later, their brilliance is no longer celebrated. It is simply expected. Their extraordinary efforts are now considered the bare minimum baseline. They are no longer a rising star, they have become a permanent fixture. Familiarity has bred absolute, silent contempt. They watched their perceived value slowly devolve from a premium asset into a basic utility. This exact same erosion occurs in personal relationships, social circles, and even casual conversations. You have likely found yourself trapped in a fading dynamic, clinging to a connection that has clearly turned toxic or one-sided. You tell yourself that you are fighting for it, that you are proving your dedication. You are not proving your dedication. You are simply eroding your own dignity in slow motion. You are allowing the other person to grow profoundly tired of you. You are training them to view your constant, unwavering presence as a minor annoyance rather than a privilege. When you are always available, always forgiving, and always the last one to leave the room, your stock plummets to zero. Scarcity dictates value. Human attention is an economy, and you are flooding the market with your own supply. To secure your power permanently, you must learn to execute the phantom exit. You must cultivate the brutal discipline required to step back when your image is at its absolute strongest. You must leave while they still want more of you. The execution of the phantom exit feels deeply counterintuitive because it violently contradicts the desires of your own ego. When you deliver a flawless presentation, when you secure a massive victory, or when you are the magnetic center of a brilliant conversation, your ego screams at you to stay. It wants to bask in the warm glow of the applause. It wants to squeeze every final drop of validation from the audience. You must deny the ego. The very moment you feel you have reached the absolute peak of the interaction, that is, the exact moment you must pack your things and walk out the door. By leaving at the height of your influence, you strip the room of the opportunity to see you decline. You force them to freeze your image in their minds at its absolute apex. Because you did not stay long enough for the conversation to become boring or for the project to become tedious, their final memory of you is tied entirely to excellence and mystery. They are left wanting more. They will talk about you after you are gone. They will wonder where you went, what you are working on next, and how you managed to remain so detached from the applause that everyone else is so desperate to hear. Absence is the ultimate amplifier of respect. Crucially, the phantom exit must be executed with absolute silence. When most people finally decide to leave a draining job, a failing relationship, or a toxic social group, they feel a desperate, burning need to explain themselves. They write long, emotional messages. They give dramatic speeches outlining their grievances and justifying their departure. They want to control the narrative and force the other side to understand their pain. This is a fatal strategic error. When you explain your exit, you are still asking for validation from the exact people you are trying to leave behind. You are giving them a target to criticize, a reason to argue, and a way to pull you back into their chaotic orbit. The true Machiavellian player understands that explanations are a form of submission. The phantom exit requires no grand declarations. You do not issue an ultimatum. You do not announce your departure. You simply stop investing. You withdraw your presence, you redirect your energy, and you fade out of the frame. You become completely unreachable, leaving them alone with the cold reality of your absence. They cannot fight a ghost, and they cannot manipulate someone who is no longer sitting at the table. This philosophy of detachment must permeate every layer of your life. It applies to the micro moments as much as the macro decisions. Make your most profound point in a meeting, and then excuse yourself. Be the warmest, most engaging person at the event, and then leave an hour before the energy dips. Notice when a version of your own identity has stopped serving you, and have the quiet courage to shed it before it becomes a prison. You must view your own presence as a high-value currency. Every time you remain in a space where you are not actively respected, challenged, or elevated, you are burning your own capital. You are bleeding leverage. The strongest individuals walking this earth are not those who can fight the longest. They are those who have mastered the supreme power of simply walking away. They know that power never announces its arrival, and it certainly never apologizes for its departure. You have now been handed the blueprint. You understand the lethal cost of hesitation, the invisible shield of being underestimated, the strategic value of the small surrender, and the devastating weight of weaponized silence. You know how to read the underlying current of the room, and you know exactly when to disappear. The mechanics of the game are no longer hidden from you. You can see the strings attached to the people around you, and more importantly, you can see the strings that were previously attached to you. Tomorrow, the game continues, but you will no longer be the one being played.